I love Game of Thrones as a TV show, and I love the books even more. But like many, I found the last seasons of the show, specifically the last, a huge disappointment that left me very bitter. Even before that point, things had started to go in a downward trend. However, prior to the disaster of the last season, when I did rewatch the show, I was able to overlook a lot of these flaws because when Game of Thrones did great things, it was truly great. Two things changed that for me, and have caused me to reflect and redefine my relationship with the show. Season 8 is obviously one of those things, but the other is my discovery of the Netflix show, The Last Kingdom. What I want to talk about in this video is the idea of what House of the Dragon can learn from The Last Kingdom, and how these important lessons could help HBO avoid the issues that Game of Thrones was plagued with during its last few seasons. What this video is not going to do is break down the whole plot of The Last Kingdom, but I highly encourage you to go and sit down and watch it. Going in, I assumed it was a budget knockoff of the History Channel's Vikings, but I was very, very wrong, and I can now count The Last Kingdom as one of my favourite TV shows of all time, perhaps more so than Game of Thrones in many ways. It has many of the elements I love about Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire. Fantastic characters, great casting, exciting battles, and lots of political intrigue. I find it kind of ironic that The Last Kingdom did Game of Thrones better than Game of Thrones actually did during Season 7 and 8. There are characters in Game of Thrones I care deeply about, but an issue I found when rewatching the show is due to the sheer scale of the story and how little we can see of some characters each episode. It can take a very, very long time to get to a point where I care about them and I'm invested in their stories in any way, with this issue only being compounded as the show diverged more and more from the book. This really hit me during the long night during Season 8, when I realised I didn't really care if any of the characters involved lived or died. The fact I was more upset at Dolorous Ed's death than any other can say a lot. What The Last Kingdom does very well is introduce a character and make you care about and be invested in their story very quickly. This is vital with the amount of battles and deaths in The Last Kingdom. Having you care about so many characters, even minor ones, so fast, adds stakes and intensity to the battles and keeps you invested in every conflict, no matter how minor they may seem at first. Taking the first season of The Last Kingdom as an example, there is one character who is only in 5 episodes before their death in battle, but their relationship and dynamic with the main character, Uhtred of Bebbanburg, leaves a lasting impact on Uhtred's character that spans the whole 5 seasons of the show. There is another who is only in 3 episodes in the first season. They have a huge impact on Uhtred and the plot of the show, and leave an impression that lasts seasons, with their brutal death proving a truly horrific and shocking plot twist. But my point is, these characters were in very few episodes. Their deaths leave a truly lasting impact on the show and the viewer during that very small amount of time. I'm trying very hard here to be as vague as I can so as not to spoil The Last Kingdom that much, in case any of you do want to watch it. But my point is, given the sheer number of characters House of the Dragon needs to introduce, and how fast the plot of the Dance of the Dragons moves, House of the Dragon will need to make the viewer care very quickly. If people are going to be invested in the early conflicts and battles, they are going to need to care for the characters. However, there is one key factor that may play in House of the Dragon's favour, and it's the scale of the story when compared to Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones spanned dozens of characters over multiple continents, whereas the scope for House of the Dragon is going to be a lot more contained and focused really around the Crown Lands, Blackwater Bay, the Reach and the Riverlands, with occasional forays to places further afield. A smaller scope of story works well for The Last Kingdom and allows for a much more focused form of story, and this is a route I think House of the Dragon will benefit from. While the grand scale of the story was a big factor that drew people to Game of Thrones in the early seasons, it definitely became clear as the show progressed they were going to really struggle to bring the different plot threads together, and the cutting of storylines like Dawn and Young Griff really show this. So House of the Dragon having this smaller scale story like The Last Kingdom might make the story easier to manage. Will the trade-off be worth it for a casual fan? It's one of those things we will only know once we actually get to see House of the Dragon. One thing I feel that I need to point out is that while the story in The Last Kingdom is smaller in scale, that does not mean it does not have high stakes and huge set-piece events that Game of Thrones became famous for. For example, the first season of The Last Kingdom sees multiple set-piece battles, multitudes of political intrigue surrounding Alfred the Great becoming king in Wessex, some fantastic character building, and deaths that hit hard. I would argue The Last Kingdom, especially in its early seasons, has more at stake than the first seasons of Game of Thrones. So, smaller scale does not mean less of a story or action, and hopefully this should be the case with House of the Dragon. The Last Kingdom is perhaps the best paced TV show I've ever watched. Not just in terms of character arcs and how the story plays out through the seasons, but down to an individual episodic level. The Last Kingdom is adapted from the Saxon Chronicles by Bernard Cornwell, with each season covering 2 of the 13 books. This means every 4 or 5 episodes there is some sort of climax that keeps the pace of the story from dragging. Now, due to this, it means that The Last Kingdom does not have time for seemingly pointless filler arcs or random scenes with no purpose that Game of Thrones would often add in order to give characters, and thus the actors, had little or undersourced source material, more to do. One that jumps to mind is Jon Snow's raid on the mutineers at Craster's Keep. While by far not the worst of the filler, and fairly entertaining, you could have told the story perfectly fine without that arc. Don't get me wrong, there can be good filler, such as often is seen in Season 1 between Cersei and Robert talking about their marriage, or Robert, Jaime and Barristan talking about their first kills. But on balance, filler really benefits a story. But this is a dilemma House of the Dragon is going to face. Yes, the story is defined and finished, which Game of Thrones did not have the blessing of. But the story itself is not to the same level of complexity and detail the main book series offers. House of the Dragon is going to have to add its own content and expand on the source material from Fire and Blood. While this is my biggest worry about the show, as long as the content they add has real purpose, akin to the added content in Season 1 of Game of Thrones, then hopefully the filler issue and its impact on pace won't be too noticeable. I mentioned The Last Kingdom is paced well, not just over a season, but down to an episodic level. Does something that no other TV show has done to me, with the closest being Game of Thrones itself, or perhaps the early seasons of Lost to some extent. It made me immediately want to watch the next episode. During my first viewing of The Last Kingdom, this resulted in me staying up till 5 AM several nights in a row, and ruining my sleep pattern for weeks after. This is done in a very simple way. The episodes almost always end right in the middle of some huge plot twist or action. For example, right in the middle of a battle, almost in an unexpected way. The next episode nearly always then picks up right where the last left off, creating this loop of saying to yourself, oh, I'll watch the start of the next episode just to see what happens next. And then before you know it, it's 5 AM. This is helped massively by the pace of the show as a whole, the lack of filler, but the way The Last Kingdom creates this need for you to keep watching is masterful. I knew they'd done something special when I watched the show with my girlfriend, who isn't too fond of action or huge battles, and even she insisted we kept watching till the early hours. She'd get in from work, then we'd watch The Last Kingdom till the early hours, and that was our life for about 2 weeks. But what is really telling is when we finished watching the show, she immediately wanted to start the show again. For me, Game of Thrones was like this for the first 4 seasons, but as the show changed, the grip it had on me did as well. House of the Dragon needs to recapture that magic from the first few seasons of Game of Thrones, and look to The Last Kingdom on the perfect way to structure an episode. With all the twists and turns in the Dance of the Dragons, there is plenty of scope to allow House of the Dragon to do something like this, and in my opinion, with the small window of time the Dance of the Dragons actually covers, it's the perfect way to emulate something like this. There is something to consider. The way the pace is handled in The Last Kingdom only works as well as it does due to the fact it handles the characters so well, and truly makes you care about them, as we have already discussed. You can't achieve this fantastic pace The Last Kingdom manages without first laying the groundwork with the characters you love and care about. House of the Dragon needs to nail this to open up the door for the pacing needed to make the show work. Both House of the Dragon and The Last Kingdom share one big advantage Game of Thrones did not. They are both adaptations of defined stories from start to finish. The last 3 Saxon Stories books were not out when The Last Kingdom began, but as stated many times by Alexander Draymond, who plays Uhtred of Bebbanburg, the producers of The Last Kingdom always had a clear 5-season plan from the beginning, covering 2 books a season. Even when the last 3 books came out, they stuck to the plan and are adapting these last 3 books as standalone movie. It's very clear that after season 4 and the way Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons was adapted to screen, the showrunners of Game of Thrones had no such plan. It's very easy to blame them going off book for this, but The Last Kingdom was also heavily criticised in later seasons for going off book, but the impact of this on the quality of the show was lessened to some extent due to how the show had been planned and structured from the beginning, or at least in my opinion. They were not simply making it up as they went along, like Game of Thrones. The lesson to take away is when you have source material, use the source material. This is going to be vital for House of the Dragon. Yes, the show has a defined, finished story to adapt from, which makes things a lot easier. However, important to remember that this story is nowhere near as fleshed out as the main book series. The showrunners and writers are going to have to expand on this framework from Fire and Blood. If they have a clear idea of what they want to do with the show, how many seasons, what each season will cover, what areas need to be expanded, minimises the risk going forward. Last Kingdom can be used as a lesson to show just how vital long-term planning on these large-scale stories are. I love Game of Thrones as a TV show, despite the flaws and disappointment, simply because I love the world of George R. R. Martin more than anything else. I have a whole channel with over 200 videos about it. The Dance of the Dragons is the perfect time period to set a prequel, and it has so much potential in my view to be a fantastic show that could surpass Game of Thrones in terms of quality storytelling. But the point of this video is not just me trying to get people to watch The Last Kingdom or criticising Game of Thrones. It's to highlight the risk factors for House of the Dragon, highlight how it needs to look at what went wrong with Game of Thrones and avoid those mistakes, how they need to look to other shows that have been well received and successful to emulate some of the elements from them that allowed them to gain that success and critical acclaim from both critics and fans. I can't think of a better example than The Last Kingdom. I know it's a show that's flown under the radar for many, but I do encourage you to go and watch it, if not just to fill the gap between now and House of the Dragon, but to understand why I am so adamant that House of the Dragon can learn something from it. And hey, George R. R. Martin said recently it's one of his favourite shows in recent years, and I don't think it's a coincidence that 2 of the cast of The Last Kingdom have been cast as Aemon One-Eye and Queen Helena. It's vital HBO learn and adapt, and don't try to just copy and paste Game of Thrones because it won't work. House of the Dragon has a lot riding on it. If it does not do well, it could very well be the end of the A Song of Ice and Fire universe on TV for a long time. That's why it's so important for the showrunners to look around and see what worked well for other shows and acknowledge the failures of Game of Thrones in its last seasons.